as a result of all the employer attacks against unions and resistance to new organizing, union density, which just means the share of the workforce that's organized into labor unions, has declined quite dramatically since the 1980s. And now in the private sector, only 6% of U.S. workers are organized by unions, meaning 94% are non-union. My name's Ruth Milkman. I'm a professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center and the Labor Studies School. So power resource theory comes out of sociology. It's very fashionable at the moment. It's basically an effort to try to identify the different ways in which labor's power can be manifested. So it specifies a whole typology of different kinds of power. There is structural power, for example. New York City subway workers have structural power because if they stop working, if they go on strike, the whole city stops dead. Another is associational power, which is really different. It's just the power that comes from uniting a bunch of workers together and coordinating their efforts to win concessions from employers. So that can take a lot of different forms, and really every worker has that potentially. Which is one of my critiques of the theory, is that it doesn't always point out the uniqueness of associational power, which kind of is a precondition for all the others. Some people talk about coalitional power, meaning the power that workers derive by building coalitions with other social actors, for example, faith leaders or politicians, elected officials like that, or other social movement organizations. Think about the example might be Occupy Wall Street, which at some moments had alliances with organized labor groups. And there are more. Discursive power is or sometimes it's called symbolic power, same thing, is the idea that by making a dramatic display of workplace abuses, you can win public sympathy and thereby derive some leverage vis-a-vis employers. And there's potentially other types of power too. It's a sort of whole list of things. And also, this is probably the single biggest limitation, the theory does not include any discussion of employer power resources, which are crucial. In any labor struggle, the way in which employers respond to workers' organizing efforts can be decisive. A recent example would be the campaign here in New York at the Amazon warehouse on Staten Island, where the workers organized quite successfully and won a National Labor Relations Board election, winning them the right to represent those workers in collective bargaining. However, Amazon's response was draconian, and this was over 2 years ago, and they still have not recognized the union legally. They continue to file objections of various kinds and delay. As a result, while it was a stunning example of the way in which organizing can succeed, they have really no prospect of winning any concessions from Amazon or any kind of collective bargaining agreement. They had a lot of symbolic power, no structural power to speak of. Turnover is about 150% in that warehouse, meaning that by 2.5 years after the thing happened, there's very few people who worked there at the time are still employed there. And what was decisive there was Amazon's deep pockets and resistance to the union. So you can't really think about workers' power and its different forms without thinking about the other side and what the response is going to be. By contrast, in sectors where workers are difficult to replace, an example would be recently interns and residents, medical doctors. You can't hire doctors off the street to replace people who go on strike. So those folks have a lot of leverage and indeed have won a collective bargaining agreement. Only in about half of the cases today where unions win recognition do they ever get a first collective bargaining agreement. And that didn't used to be true, but starting in the late 70s, early 80s, employers adopted that approach more and more. And again, unless you have a lot of power leverage to either stop the company from functioning, or if you're difficult to replace, like the example I gave a minute ago, then that can go on indefinitely. It's happening right now at Starbucks. Workers have been organizing there now for several years. They've won at about 500 of the Starbucks shops. They've won elections. Quite a while, Starbucks refused to negotiate at all. Then in February of this year, February 2024, They did finally agree to negotiate, but that was 6 months ago, and basically nothing's come of it, and maybe it still will, but I suspect they're engaging in surface bargaining. It's hard to even win a union election or to win recognition, but in half the cases where that much is accomplished, nothing comes of it in terms of collective bargaining. The way that has come about is through employer manipulation of the original law. So it used to function reasonably well. There would be these elections, workers would vote to be unionized, the employer would negotiate, they'd come up with some kind of contract, and so on. And that happened throughout the late 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s even. But starting in the late 70s, when kind of everything changes in terms of, most people call it the neoliberal period, as that transition took place, employers began to decide that they really didn't want unions, and they did all kinds of things to try to both manipulate the law and also to attack unions where they were already established. That took a lot of different forms. So again, you got to look at the employer side of the equation. Where the action is today in organized labor and in labor organizing is with young workers, and especially college-educated young workers. The campaigns at places like Amazon and Starbucks that we've already talked about a little bit today were led by that generation. Actually, many campaigns have been led by them in recent times, including in 2018, there were a bunch of teacher strikes around the country, starting in West Virginia, then Oklahoma, then Arizona, and so on. The way I understand this phenomenon is through the lens of the 2008 financial crisis, because that really kind of pulled the rug out from under a whole generation of college-educated workers who had been told throughout their childhoods and teen years that if they studied hard and went to college and graduated and did everything right, they would have a ticket to some kind of middle-class existence. And instead, they hit the post-Great Recession labor market, where new labor market entrants like them were particularly disadvantaged, and many of them found that, what could they get as a job? They could work at Starbucks, or they could get a part-time retail job or something like that. Or if they had even more advanced training, say in academia, and they had worked toward a PhD, there weren't enough tenure track jobs for many of them to win, and so therefore they became adjuncts, working at a fraction of the pay with no job security. So this was a very radicalizing experience. And there were other disappointments, too, for that generation. They had been told they lived in a post-racial society, and then they saw the police brutality. And this is way before 2020, the George Floyd case that we all remember vividly. This actually started way before that in the teens. This is the generation that led the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011. With some colleagues, I did some research on that movement, and we discovered through a survey we did here in New York that the vast majority of the activists were young, highly educated, from relatively affluent backgrounds who had experienced this kind of thing. So, and at that time, there was activity like Occupy. There was a version of Black Lives Matter emerged shortly after that. There was the Me Too movement, which began on college campuses, actually, which is now forgotten, when it shifted to people like Harvey Weinstein, but there was, that generation was involved in that as well. They weren't that interested in labor in the early days, but since the pandemic, that has become a major site of millennial and Gen Z activism, and some people call them Generation Union. Because this is sort of, it's actually shifted more to Gaza now, but that's what brought us the Amazon, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, et cetera, campaigns, as well as the less famous cases of the highly educated professional types who, like I said before, have actually got more leverage than the ones in the iconic Fortune 500 companies. But all of it is from that generation. And again, led by the highly educated component of it, who are in a way, both better positioned and have more confidence in their own ability to change the world than their less privileged counterparts in the same generations, who are also, if you look at the polls, support for labor unions in the whole population in the United States has risen quite substantially in recent times, but it's particularly high among that generation. As a result of all the employer attacks against unions and resistance to new organizing, what scholars call union density, which just means the share of the workforce that's organized into labor unions, has declined quite dramatically since the 1980s. And now in the private sector, only 6% of U.S. workers are organized by unions, meaning 94% are non-union. And that's a result of the employer assault on organized labor that we've seen over the years. And there's a political assault, too. Many people see as a turning point the 1981 air controllers strike, when then President Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers for going on strike. It was an illegal strike technically, but this had not happened in a very long time. Normally, federal workers who went on strike won stuff. In this case, they were all fired. And that was sort of a green light to corporations to go ahead and, continue their attacks that had already begun, but then accelerated against unions in the private sector. The law is still in place, but it's been hollowed out. The system doesn't really work. Employers have basically figured out all kinds of tactics with the help of so-called labor consultants, otherwise known as union busters, who are lawyers who advise private sector employers about how to respond to any union organizing effort. And they've got it down to a very routine playbook that they are able to implement. In this political climate, there is no prospect of labor law reform. However, in the 1930s, the big upsurge of unionism began before the laws were passed. That's how it works. So the law could change if workers were able to organize in a way that was sufficiently disruptive to make the political elected officials believe that they had to do something. I mean, it's not inconceivable. I'm not very optimistic. The other thing I want to say is that although there's been a lot of excitement and interest in the recent union organizing that we've been discussing today, it has not moved the needle on union density. It remains 6% in the private sector. It's happening on too small a scale to make any difference in that situation. This is a big country. There's something like 150 million people, in the labor force. It's probably more than that by now, but in that neighborhood. And so you have to organize an awful lot of workers to make a dent in that, given that companies are constantly opening and closing, and there's a lot of churning in the labor market. So to actually increase union density requires organizing on a very large scale, and we have not seen that. We've seen small scale organizing, some of which has gotten a lot of public attention, but the numbers are too small to make that difference. We do know from history that union organizing seems to come in big waves, not like one Starbucks coffee shop at a time. And so, it's not impossible to imagine that happening again, but we're not there. This could be the beginning of such a wave, I suppose, the activity that we've seen in the last few years. And we haven't really talked about the pandemic, but that's another important ingredient in the story here for several reasons. Probably the single most important is that the pandemic created a very tight labor market, which means that workers are less fearful of organizing because they know that jobs are plentiful, and if things don't work out, if they try to organize and they get fired for it, which happens every day, although it is illegal under the National Labor Relations Act, they can get another job at another coffee shop or whatever it is. And the pandemic itself, with all the discussion of so-called essential workers and the spotlight on employer abuses during the lockdown period when people were literally risking their lives to go to work and the employers seemed very indifferent, that sort of raised consciousness and awareness and interest in labor organizing, again, especially among the young. So the pandemic was a kind of key turning point, although this wave of new activity from the younger workers began before that, but then it really accelerated after 2020. Now, if the labor market loosens, which is bound to happen sooner or later, it hasn't really happened yet, but if unemployment were to spike upward, that would hurt this effort, I think. It would make people think twice about it in a way that they haven't really had to right now. So that's another factor. So there is a piece of legislation that's been proposed in Congress year after year. It's called the PRO Act, and it's the latest version of an effort to fix the problems with the labor law, with the dysfunctional labor law system that, again, has been kind of captured by employers in all kinds of ways. At the moment, with the political gridlock in Congress, it does not have a prayer of being passed. And I have to say, even under Democratic administrations, there have been a series of proposals along these lines. So, for example, when Barack Obama became president in 2009, many people hoped that something it was then called the EFCA, the Employee Free Choice Act, which was similar to the PRO Act, would become law, but it never did. So under Democrats and Republicans alike, this has been a very heavy lift, and I think is likely to remain so. So I'm not very optimistic about labor law reform, short of, a major disruption that, sort of forces people to pay attention to this, which, I guess that could happen, but it doesn't seem like it's in the cards anytime soon.